Today I'm using my 5x7 hoop, cutaway stabiliser, my scissors, masking tape, thread. I've got my batting, I'm using 100% pure cotton. I've got my fabrics, including for the back. I've got some fur trim as well that I'm going to add on to afterwards, and I've prepared my handles for the bag as well. Before I stitch a patchwork type design like this, I like to plan it out, and so what I've done is I've used some tearaway stabiliser, and I've stitched out colour number 2 of every file onto it, and I've joined it as if I would with tape, the way that it's going to go together. So that allows me to put on here the order that is going to be the fabrics are going to be added, and also the fabrics I'm going to use on each part, and it allows me then to make sure that I haven't got the same fabrics next to each other. It just makes life a little bit easier. I'm now going to hoop my cutaway stabiliser. I'm going to put it in my machine and stitch round 1, which is the outline. Now I'm going to put my batting over the top of this outline, making sure that all the lines are covered. Pop it back in my machine and stitch it down. With the outline done, I'm now going to trim away all the excess batting. It's now time to start putting the fabrics down. Now, fabrics number 1 goes here and fabric number 2 goes here. Now, I've also got to leave plenty of seam allowance, so where possible I'm going to take my fabrics right up to the edge of my hoop there. So the first one is this panel here, so I'm going to lay that there, and it's got to straddle this line so that the raw edge falls on this side, like so, and the first one goes up the right way. The second one, however, goes face down, and that has to straddle this line as well. So, and it also has to allow seam allowance up the top there, so that when this is pulled back here, it covers all the way to my hoop. So that's going to go there. I'm now going to pop it back in my machine and stitch it down. Now that it's stitched down, I'm going to pull that back and finger press that crease so that it forms a nice sharp crease, and I'm going to pop it back in my machine, and it's going to stitch down around the edges. No need to remove my hoop this time because it's round number 5, which is the stipple stitching. Round number 6 is the decorative stitching along this seam here. So I've changed my thread colour, and I'm going to stitch that next. My third fabric is going to be attached along this line here, so I'm going to place it face down along, overlapping this line so that the raw edge is this side. Let's just turn that around, it might be a bit easier. I don't think there's a direction on this. No, that's fine. You do have to be a bit mindful of the direction of your fabrics, if they have got a right way up and a wrong way up. So I've placed that down. I've got plenty here so that when that folds back, I've got my seam allowance. I don't have to worry about this side here too much because it's all going to be cut away so that it can be joined to the next panel. So I'm going to pop that in my machine and stitch that down now. Now that fabric number 3 is stitched down, I'm going to pull that back as I did for fabric number 2. Finger press the crease and then pop it back in my machine to be stitched down. I've changed my thread back to blue because the next round, round number 9, is the stippling stitch for this panel. The next round of stitching is number 10, and that's going to do the decorative stitching along the join of fabric number 3, and I've changed my thread back to the orangey gold for this. I'm now going to add panel number 4, fabric number 4, sorry, and my fabric has actually got a right way up, so I want to make sure that I get it right or at a slight angle, and I'm going to do it at a slight angle for this, and I'm going to put it over this stitch line here with the raw side of the fabric this side of it, so that when it's folded back it gives me not only my seam allowance, but it's the right way up as well. So I'm just going to pop that there. And I'm going to pop it in my machine and stitch it down. I'm going to trim back this fabric a little bit so that it's not as bulky. This is just the excess from fabric number 3. Okay, and I'm going to bring that forward, pop it into my machine and stitch round number 12, which will hold it all down. I've changed my thread back to blue again because the next round, number 13, is the quilting stitch. I've changed my thread back to the orange gold again. Next is round number 14, which is the decorative stitching that goes across the join of fabric number 4. I'm going to place fabric number 5 along this line here. Now I have to make sure that I cover the whole area, plus allow my seam allowance down the bottom here. Not too worried about the side, but certainly down the bottom. So when I fold it back, I need this fabric up to my hoop ideally. So I place it there, pop it back in my machine and stitch it down. Okay, so now I'm going to pull that back, finger press it as before, pop it back in my machine and stitch round number 16. After that it will do the decorative stitching along the join, which will be round number 17. I will be skipping rounds number 18 and 19, which are the motifs, because they're butterflies and flowers and it's not going to go too well with my seasonal fabric. And this is round number 17, the decorative stitching. Now that's all stitched out, I'm going to remove all the excess fabric along this edge. I still want to leave fabric here for my seam allowance, so I'm going to cut in at an angle here. I'm going to trim back the batting here just so that it's nice and close to the stitching, because when I come to join this to the next piece that we're going to make, I want to make sure that it sits very, very snugly. Okay, I can now remove it from my hoop and hoop up for the second panel. So I'm going to hoop up my stabiliser once more. Oops. I'm now going to pop it back into my machine to stitch the outline. I've loaded the second file for the middle panel into my machine. I'm now going to stitch round 1. I'm going to put the batting over the outline, pop it back into my machine and stitch round 2. Now time to start adding our fabrics. I'm going to add fabric 1 to here, and that will be placed right face up. Now it's here and here that we have to be careful of this time. This side and this side will be cut away eventually, so we need our seam allowance top and bottom. So I'm just going to pop that there, like so. And my second fabric is going to straddle this line here. Let's just put a little crease in there so that we can see where we're putting it. And I want to put it face down. There isn't a face on this one, but if you were, you put it face down. And you want the raw edge this side, not that side. So when that folds back, that will fold back like that. Okay, I'm going to pop that in my machine and stitch it down. Now stitching round 3. Now that that's stitched down, I'm going to pull this back, give it a good crease with my nail and pop it back in my machine, and it's going to stitch it down, and this will be round number 4. The next round is the stipple stitching. That's round 5. The next round is round number 6, and that's a decorative stitching along the join of fabrics 1 and 2. So I've changed my thread to the orange gold for this. I'm now going to add my third fabric, and I want this face down. Now I want it to be up the right way, so I'm going to flip it down, put it over the line, so that when it flips back up again, it's up the right way, because as you can see on the top of the bauble here, it will make a difference to which way I need to put it. So I'm now going to put that back in my machine and stitch round number 7. I'm now going to trim off this piece of excess fabric, just to remove the bulk a little bit before I stitch it in place. Okay, so I'm now going to pop that up there like that, give it a good crease with my nail, put it in my machine and stitch down round number 8. And now the decorative stitching, which is round number 9. I've still got my orange gold thread in my machine here. So now it's time to add my 4th fabric to this panel. I haven't got a direction on this one. The raw edge needs to go this side, so it goes across this line, so that when it flips up, it covers there. And I need to make sure that I've got enough fabric as well for it to allow for the seam allowance too. So I'm going to put that quite close to the line. Be aware of this corner. It's very easy to misalign it, so that when that flips up you miss this corner, so be careful. Okay, I'm now going to pop that back into my machine and stitch it down with round number 10. Now that that's stitched down, I'm going to trim across here to remove the bulk. Flip that back, crease it well with my nail, pop it in my machine and stitch it down with round number 11. Round number 12 is the quilting stitch, so I'm going to do that next. I've got blue thread in my machine again for this. Next is round number 12, the quilting stitch, and I've changed my thread back to blue for this. Round number 13 is the decorative stitch on the join between fabrics number 3 and 4. So I've changed my thread back to orange gold again, and I'm now going to stitch that. Now that's all stitched, I've got to remove all the excess fabric and batting from both sides. The batting I should have removed earlier, but I forgot, so I'm going to do it now. I'm going to cut away at an angle the corner here, so I preserve as much of this for my seam allowance as possible, and I'll do exactly the same up here. I'm trying to get as close to the stitching as I possibly can. Okay, I'm now just going to remove this batting under here. Being careful not to cut my fabric, of course. Okay. Just going to stick that up out the way. I should have done this after I'd done the positioning around number 2, so still never mind, it's sorted now. Let's get rid of those little bits of fluffies. Okay. Next comes to join part 1 to part number 2, and we're going to do this along here. Let's take this. I'm going to remove the stabiliser from this. I still want to preserve as much around the edge as possible. Okay, so now this is going to join along here, like so. Just remove any white here showing. Okay. What you want to do is sit this stitch line on top of this stitch line. Now normally I end up having to pin this because it does it is quite bulky and it moves, so I'm going for the second, I'm just going to stick it down, just hold it in place while I actually pin it. Let's get my pins out. Now with pins, you want to keep them as far away from your machine stitch line as possible because they can do a lot of damage. I don't like putting pins in, but sometimes there's no choice, you have to. So my stitch line is going to be here, my pins are going to be right the way back here, safely out the way. Line up the edge stitching as well, so that it all aligns nicely. And once again, I'm putting a pin in here, right back out of the way. And now the same for the top. Bit tricky this because I'm left-handed, so and I'm having to do it right-handed. So now another pin goes in here. Oops. There we are. And I'm now going to pop that in my machine and stitch round number 14. Now it says in the instructions to slow your machine down. The only way that I've got of doing that on mine is to stop it. So I'm going to see how it goes, and I might just sort of tweak it in place with my finger as it's stitching. Not over my finger, of course. I'm now going to stitch the decorative stitching, which is rounds 15, 16 and 17. I won't be stitching 18 and 19 because they're flowers and butterflies, and I don't want to put that with winter fabrics. I will be putting a snowflake in, and I'll show you how to do that in a bit. If you're going to stitch a motif, the initial, then you'll be doing that as round 20. I won't be doing that either. So I'm now going to stitch round number 15, round number 16, round number 17. Now that's all been stitched, where I haven't done the motif in the middle here, you'll see that there's a gap. So I'm going to fill that with a snowflake. I've designed this snowflake myself, and I've provided it as a freebie in the link in the description below. So please feel free to download it if you would prefer to put a snowflake in instead. And I'm going to show you how to position it so that it stitches perfectly in the center of this gap here. I'm going to load my snowflake design, and along the side here I've got colour check, then I've got another symbol that looks like a pair of scissors, and then adjust. I'm going to push adjust, and then I'm going to choose the layout, this little icon at the bottom here. And on here I have got up and down arrows and left and right arrows, and it's with this that I'm able to position my needle to tell the machine where I want it to start. Now all designs, when you load them, are normally in the middle, so I know that if I align my needle exactly where I want the middle to be, then it's going to stitch in the right direction. And now I'm going to use those arrows to position my needle bang smack in the middle of there. And using my needle up and down button on my machine here, I can check the position of my needle before I actually start stitching it. So I'm just going to pop that down. And if I lift that up, you can see that's exactly where I want it to be. So now I can just push the go button on my machine, and it will stitch the snowflake in the right position. I'm just going to trim this thread. Okay, so now my snowflake is stitched. I don't know if you can see that on camera, I hope you can. It's time to remove everything from the hoop, so I'm going to remove my pins to start off with. Then I'm going to turn this over. I want to preserve as much of the stabiliser as I can along this top and bottom edge, so I'm going to cut in at an angle and then cut down the line of the edges. And then out again on the corner. I'm going to do exactly the same the other side. I've got my fingers behind here because I've got the fabric, or the back of the fabric should I say, here. So I'm just holding my fingers so that I don't end up cutting away at my fabric and my stitches. Go around that. Be careful on here because you've got stitches here as well. And out to the corner. So now I can remove it from my hoop. And I'm just going to trim away that piece there. And there I have my 2 panels joined, and I'm ready to stitch my third one out. And these 2 will be joined, stitched and joined exactly the same to the third panel, and the third panel will be stitched exactly the same way as these 2. Okay, let's hoop up for the third one. I've loaded the third file into my machine all ready to stitch, and also my blue thread. Okay, so I'm going to load that into my machine and stitch round 1, which is the outline. I'm going to place my batting over the outline, pop it back in my machine and stitch it down so that it gives me the placement lines for my fabric. So it's time to add my fabrics. This box here is fabric number 1, so I'm going to place my first fabric over, making sure that I've got plenty of seam allowance this side. Then I'm just going to put a little bit of a crease in this so I can see where to put fabric number 2. So fabric number 2, raw edge towards this side, over that line. Yet again, leave plenty of seam allowance around here. I'm going to pop that in my machine and stitch it down with round number 3. A lot of this you'll be able to do without taking your hoop out of your machine, but just so that you can see clearly what I'm up to, I thought it's easier if I take it out each time. So now that that's stitched down, I'm going to fold that back and once again crease it well with my nail, pop it back in my machine and stitch round number 4, which will stitch both pieces down. The next round of stitching is the quilting stitch. Round number 6 is the decorative stitching, so I've changed my thread back to the orange gold for this. I'm now going to trim back some of this excess fabric here to reduce some of the bulk. And it's time to add my third fabric as well. Now this is the box that it's going to cover. And just remove the label from it, it doesn't want to come unstuck. Okay, always happens on camera. Okay, so right side and the wrong side to my fabric, I'm going to turn it over so that I've got the wrong side facing upwards, place it over this line here so that when it's folded back it covers, and make sure that I've got enough seam allowance on the edge there as well. Be careful of this corner here that you do get that enough fabric over it to cover it. I'm now going to pop that back in my machine and stitch round number 7 to stitch it down. Now I'm going to open that out, give it a really good creasing with my nail so that it holds nicely in position. Pop it back into my machine and it's going to stitch that down with round number 8. Round number 9 is the decorative stitching between fabrics 2 and 3 and 1 as well. So I'm now going to do that. in the instructions, rounds 10 will be the guideline for the lace, 11 to attach the lace, and 12 will be the decorative stitching to go on top. I'm not doing those on this as I'm not adding lace, so I'm going to skip straight to round 13 now. I've got to add my next piece of fabric, which is going to attach along this line here and fold up onto there. So I'm going to trim away the excess first so I can see what I'm doing. I need to be careful here obviously because I'm going to need this for seam allowance. Okay, so I'm going to place my fabric so that it is upside down, raw edge to the top here of this stitch line, so that when it folds back it's covering the edges here. So I want to get that as close to this side as I possibly can because I want the seam allowance here. I think that looks okay, so I'm just going to fold that back and stitch it in place. Now when you fold back, make sure that you get this edge here. You don't want to miss, you know, your corner there, so just be careful. Okay, I'm now going to stitch round number 13. I'm going to fold my fabric up now and crease it really well along that line. Pop it back into my machine and stitch round number 14. And I've got blue thread in my machine to do the quilting stitching, which is round number 15. I'm going to trim off the excess fabric. And then I'm going to add my next fabric, number 5, and that's going to join on this line and flip back there like so. So once again, make sure that I get this corner in and plenty over here for my seam allowance. I'm now going to pop that back in my machine and stitch round number 16. I'm going to fold this back, once again give it a really good creasing, pop it back in my machine and stitch round number 17. Okay, now time to trim it up, and yet again I forgot to trim back the batting after round 2, so I'm going to do that again now. I'm going to use a bit of tape. Now along here I can trim right back to the stitch line because that's where we're going to be joining our next piece. But first off, I'm just going to hold that back while I trim back the batting. It won't make any difference at this stage whether I do it now or before, but it would have been easier obviously because you haven't got the fabric in your way and you don't want to end up accidentally cutting your fabric. Not this fabric now. I'm still leaving plenty here for my seam allowance. I can always take it off later if I need to, but I can't add it on once it is off. Looks like the stick's gone out of my tape here, so I'm just going to add a bit more. Okay. Okay, so that's all the excess removed now. I'm just going to make sure that this is really well trimmed up along here because that's my join. And I want that as close to the stitching as I can possibly get it. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so now I'm going to do the join, and exactly the same way as I did before, I'm going to be pinning this again, but first off I'm going to tape it in place just to hold it down while I position it with the pins. So I want my stitch lining here lining up, and the same at the top here. I'm going to pop a couple of pins in as I did before, and exactly the same, well out of the way of the stitch line. I don't want my pins getting caught up in the needle and damaging my machine. And the bottom. Back a bit further, I think. That's better. Okay, I'm now going to pop that in my machine and do round number 18, after having taken the tape off, of course. I will use the stop and start button to slow it down if I need to, and just to make sure that these actually stay on the lines when it's stitching. So I might have to sort of guide it with my hands a little. I'm now going to stitch colours 19 to 23. I won't be doing 24, 25 and 26 because once again it's flowers, and I will be putting a snowflake in the centre as I did before, in the area where the flower would be. So I'm doing round number 19 now. Now round 20. Round 21. Round 22. And round 23. I'm now going to load my snowflake design because that's going to go in the middle here, and I'm going to position it exactly as I did before. So I've loaded the snowflake, I've brought up the adjust panel, and I'm using the arrows yet again to centre my needle in the middle of where these three lines converge. That looks good to me. Okay, so I'm now going to change colours because I haven't done that yet, and then stitch out my snowflake. Okay, so I've got my blue thread in my machine. The needle's all lined up where I want it to, and now I'm just going to stitch out the snowflake. Okay, I don't know if you can see this very well, but there's my snowflake there. Right, time to remove this from the hoop, and that's my panel completed. Remove the pins, and now I'm going to cut away from the stabiliser. Oops, there we are. Now I'm keeping the outside edge there, and I should have kept that as well, but never mind. cut around this snowflake. And up here. Remove it from the hoop. And trim this up. Oh, I've lost my scissors. Okay. So that and that. I should have kept this bit here so that it was just like that. As you know, I wrongly cut away the stabiliser from this edge, but worse than that, I actually managed to nick the fabric with my scissors, and luckily for me it's this side of the stitch line. So to put that right, albeit a temporary patch until it's all sewn together, I've taken a piece of, or cut a piece of cutaway stabiliser. I've used my spray basting, which is proper haberdashery patchwork temporary glue. I've given it a misting, and then I've stuck the cutaway stabiliser down over the top to hold it. Now that will stay in there, that's as it would have done anyway, and it will rescue this area where I cut through here until such times as it's stitched. After that, nobody will know any of the different. So that's how to rescue if you do accidentally nick your fabrics. I'm now going to start piecing together to make the bag. I've got my panel, and the first thing that we've got to do is trim up all around the edges to 1/2 inch. Now I'm going to do this from the opposite side because it's easy to see. So I'm going to use my quarters ruler, and mine is actually in centimetres, so I'm going to line it up to 12 millimetres, which is to this line here, and I'm just going to put it on the stitch line like so. Now you can use scissors, you can draw a line and then cut with scissors. I'm going to use my roller cutter, and just out of convenience and speed. Now I'm a bit short for space here, so please do bear with me. Okay. Now I'm going to turn it round and do the other side. Now, stitched into your stabiliser there are 2 marks, and I've highlighted these with my chalk pen so that you can see them. They are for aligning the bottom, so I just wanted to point those out so that you knew that they were there. So now I'm going to align this to 1/2 inch as well. Once again, cut through. And now for the edges. And last one. Okay. So that's all now trimmed up, more or less. Let's just trim that bit there. Okay. Next we're going to start piecing everything together. I'm going to be putting handles on my bag, So I'm going to show you how I made them. You're going to end up with two this size. So I've cut 2 pieces of fabric to 18 by 6, and then I've folded them in half and pressed them, opened it back out, and then this edge is then folded to the middle line, to the crease line, and pressed again. And I've done the same for both sides, just the same as you would for bias binding, and then over again. And the next job for these will be to run 2 lines of stitching, one down here and one down here on each of the handles. And I'm going to set my needle so that it's stitching to the right of the foot. So that's my first one done, and I'm going to do exactly the same with my second one. I've got my panel, and on the stabiliser there's 2 stitched marks. I've highlighted them with my chalk pen here so you can see them, one here and one here, and I've folded this in half, lining up the stitching, and marked off at my halfway point, because next I need to add the bottom of my bag. So I've folded this in half as well and marked off the halfway point, and because this needs to be sewn to this this way around and then folded over, what I'm doing is placing that down and then lining that mark up with that one, like so, and then pinning it. Now I'm going to be stitching from this side, which is why I'm putting my pins this side, because it's easier to see the line of stitching. So now that that's pinned, I can now sew from that mark there along here to that mark there. And I'm actually going to stitch on top of the existing stitching underneath. So now that that's stitched, I can remove all the pins. And now you can see that the bottom is firmly stitched in place, and also the stitching from the edge of the front panel is also hidden because I stitched right along the top of the existing stitching. So now I've got to put my handles on, and I'm going to go back to my little piece of cardboard, my measure that I prepared earlier. Now on the 2.5 inch line, put it on the edge of your on the side of the bag, and then put the handle facing towards the top, the raw edge facing towards the top edge of the panel, and then pin it in place. And the reason why you need 2.5 inches is because the edge from here to there is going to be taken up with the side of the bag. so you want to make sure that it's going to clear the side. So now I'm going to fold that under and form a right angle, and then fold it up above again so it's facing towards the top. And once again I'm going to put my 2.5 inch line on the edge and my handle piece at the end and pin it. That way I know that both handles are going to be an equal distance and clear the sides. I want to add a fur trim to the top of my bag, so I've got my faux fur there, I've got my bag, my handles are pinned up, and I'm going to pin this face to face I just want it to go a little way past here so I can trim it up afterwards. That way I can make sure that it's nice, neat and straight. Got some threadies here. Want one more where the handle is here, and the actual pins in the handle I'm going to move down slightly so that they're not protruding up the top where I'm going to stitch. Okay, like so. So then I would stitch along here all the way along from edge to edge. Now I can remove the pins. Turn that over. And now I'm going to do the same with the lining. So I'm just going to line up the lining with the front and then pin it. I've put the lining and aligned it up to one edge of my front panel because this is a bit tricky to do and I couldn't see straight with the camera under my nose. So I pinned the edge of this up here so that I could align the top here to this the fur. Where it's stretchy, it's a bit tricky. So now I can pin as I did before for the front all the way along here. I've just got a couple of pins in the back just holding it in place so that it doesn't stretch all over the place. And once that's stitched and opened out, I'll be able to trim up everything so that it's all nice and flush. So now I'm going to stitch all the way along here, but first I want to mark my stitch line. So I'm going to take my little template again, put it on the edge, and measure off a 1/2 inch stitch line. Put my ruler over there. draw my line. Now I'm going to stitch all the way along that line. So now I'm going to take the pins out. Now when I open this out, with any luck, everything's all straight. So what I am going to do is turn this round and I'm going to straighten up my fabric. Make sure that that's aligned properly, and then I'm going to trim off this end. Now I'm going to trim up the other side. This time I'm going to place that there like so, and I'm going to line up these corners and pin them. On the bottom edge here. Oops. That way I know that this is sitting nice and square. So you can't see what I'm doing there. Okay, I've put another pin in up here as well. So now I'm going to take my rule, line it up to the edge of my panel and trim the whole lot. Now I know that that is all nice and square on both sides. For the back I've done exactly the same as I did for the front. I've pinned on the fleece and obviously we've got the handle underneath, and then I've also pinned the other side, and I'm now going to stitch them both onto the fur. Now I'm going to take the pins out. Okay. Now I'm going to fold this in half. Just pin where it's not going to get in the way, just so that it holds everything square. And the same up here. I'm going to line these two corners up just so that they are nicely aligned and sit well. I'll pop a pin in there. And I'm popping the pins down this way this time so that when I cut, they're not going to be in the way. And now the same for this edge. Okay. I can get my rule. Lay it down the edge so that it's nice and flush. And with my circular cutter, trim off the edge. And I'm going to turn it over and do exactly the same again. So now I have my back and my front. I've got one more little job to do with this before it's ready to stitch together as a whole. And that's to put the batting in, just to give it a little bit of body. So I've got my batting here. And I'm going to take it up to the stitch line. There, let's just turn that over. So that I've got 1/2 inch each side. Like so. Okay, so now my two pieces, my front and my back, are ready to join together nearly. All it remains to do is to sort these corners out now. So with the little rule that you made earlier, the little gauge, what you're going to do is the edge needs to be 2 inches square, allowing for 1/2 inch of seam allowance all round. So with the 1.5 inch side, we're going to align it to the edge and to the stitch line, like so, and you're going to cut, mark and then cut straight down. Exactly the same the other side. Onto the edge and onto the panel stitch line and down there. And that allows us a 1/2 inch seam allowance here, here and at the bottom as well. So now all that remains to do is to trim it up, and I'm going to trim through both top and bottom piece. There, and level with the panel. Just this little bit of edge here. and the same this side. So trim it level. And this little edge on here. Okay, so that's now ready. Oops, didn't cut quite through the backing piece there. Okay, that's good. So that's now ready to join to the back piece, and I'm going to do exactly the same with here. So I just want to get these lined up. And pinned. Like so. Now I've got 2.5 from the bottom, because I've got 1/2 inch seam allowance at the bottom here. So what I'm going to do this time is draw in my top line at 2.5, and now I'm going to put in my 1.5 line down here, and the same the other side. From this top line I've got to come down 1/2 inch, because that would be the stitch line and this would be the bottom of the panel. I'll do exactly the same this side. And now when I cut this line here and down there. Want to line these up properly, and just slightly out. My bag is now ready to join the two pieces together. With this front panel and the lining, I've pinned it so that it's inside out, and then I drew a line 1/2 inch away all the way around the edge here. And that's going to be my stitch line. However, the corners here between that line there and that line there are not going to be stitched straight away. So I now open that out, turn it over so that I've got the right side facing up. I've got the back of the bag here, and I want the handles facing the same way, and then I'm going to flip this over so that right sides are together, and then I'm going to turn this over and I'm going to pin it together all the way around so that everything is all lined up, and these pieces here I want going towards each other. Make sure all the corners are nicely lined up as well. Everything should sit well and together. Both the back and the front I want facing upwards here. The snoring in the background is my cat. Okay, now I'm going to do the same this side. Now I've got to leave a gap so that I can turn this out the right way afterwards, and I'm going to do that in the bottom of the bag here, in the lining. I don't want to do it in the part that's got the panel in, the patchwork panel, because otherwise I'll have a hole in the bottom of the bag. Okay, now then, get these corners together. Like so. I'm going to put a pin in here to hold these up, so when my machine excuse me, goes over it, it keeps them facing the same way. Do the same over this side and on here as well. got one more thing to do. Where I've got the opening, well, where I'm going to have the opening to allow it to be turned inside out, I'm going to put 2 pins in as a reminder to stop there. Okay, so now all that remains is for me to put my 1/2 inch line in here. And just down each side here. Okay, all I need to do now is stitch along here, and I stop at the 1/2 inch marks, leave the corners out, then I'm going to stitch from here, from the corner of the stitch line there, all the way up to here where the 2 lines intersect, leave out the corners, and then I'm just going to stitch a little bit there and here up to the 1/2 inch line, and then that will be all the stitching finished. And the last little piece here. Okay, so that's all stitched, so I can now remove all the pins. The last thing that remains now is our corners. What I've done is I've drawn a line each side of my fabrics, so on the front and back of each corner, and the reason being because it makes it easier to see what you're doing. Now, to do the corners, this line here, or should I say this edge here, will marry up to this edge here, and this one here will marry up to this one here. Now, where you've got the 2 lines that meet, pinch and pull, and with a little bit of careful manipulation you'll find that your corners should just fall into place, in theory. Okay, so then you're going to pin them together. Now, you've got a stitch line here and you've got a stitch line here, and you want to try and match up those 2 stitch lines as closely as possible, because by doing that you end up with a very neat ends on your bags, and all the seams line up. So I've put my pin through on my stitch line. I'll just pull that back so you can see. There's my stitch line. I've put my pin through. It's married up on that stitch line as well. So now I can just pin it. And what I'm going to do is just twist that slightly, so that it all lays flat, and you should have a nice neat edge along there. And then what you would do once it's pinned, you will stitch right along there, and that will form your corner. I'm going to jiggle about with this off camera so that it all lines up. I've already done the other corners, so you can see here I'll be stitching straight across here on all the others, and straight across here. Okay, so I'm going to stitch across the first corner now. Now for the second corner. Now for the third corner. And now for the last corner. Okay, so now all it remains is for me to turn it out the right way through the gap that I've left in the bottom of my bag. I'm careful not to stab myself with the pins from the handles. Just going to push the corners out. Hopefully they'll be more or less lined up. So far so good. Okay, there's only one that's a little bit misaligned, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. So now I'm going to pull this taut, just do a little line of stitching down there to close it up. It's not going to be seen, it's in the bottom of the bag, so I'm not too bothered about a little seam. Okay, once again I'm going to set my needle to the right of my foot so that I can get a smaller seam as possible. Now I'm just going to close it up. Now that the bottom's all sewn up, all that remains is for me to push the lining inside the bag and push the corners of the lining into the corners of the outside. Okay. If you wanted to, you could do a line of top stitch around here just to stop the lining from slipping around. I'm not going to bother because by the time you've got a few bits and bobs inside, it's not going to move. And there's the handles. And I'm sure you'll agree that's a very pretty bag. I hope you enjoyed this. Please give me a thumbs up if you did. And don't forget to subscribe, and I hope to see you again next time.